Chat. Big Spell Mage is the best deck. And now, you too could be a big Spell Mage. I cast Tsunami. I cast Sunset Volley. Wow!
Hey guys, MakiahTime here. Today's video is about Big Spell Mage. Specifically, BrrBBuPPBvXiBsnoBg. 40 cards. XL. All of the above. Yep. I have talked about this deck previously on this channel, well, the 30 card version, but it seems to have survived its previous nerfs, moving Portalmancer Skyla from 5 to 6 mana. And rather than watching this deck kind of fade into irrelevance, it's actually improved over time because of the Renathal event and just smart deck building decisions that players have made over time to make the deck more efficient, give it a little bit more of a long game, and kind of expand on the original idea of having kind of just like a scam mage deck. Despite the initial cost of this deck being relatively high, it does have a lot of legendaries and epics. I do think this is one of the best decks to play as a new player because it's just so simple to pick up and easy to pilot compared to some of the other decks we've talked about on this channel. And I also expect this deck to be pretty good for a long time. I expect it to be good into the next expansion. And it's somewhat evergreen in the idea that there's a lot of cards that make this package work. So let's hop into it. The Mulligan guide for this deck is straightforward. You want Portalmancer Skyla and King Tide more than anything else. I find that the more aggressively I mulligan for these powerful enablers, the more likely I am to win the game. Secondary enablers are also good to keep, such as your Metal Detector and Cease Chill. These two rogue cards can enable a turn 4 6-mana minion, even when you're going first. If you have a Metal Detector or Cease Chill, you can keep your 6-mana big minion, such as Norganon and Puzzle Master Khadgar. If you have either enabler card, you can keep Tsunami or Sunset Volley or even Watercolor Artist. I also like to keep Miracle Salesman because it's a solid turn 1 in almost every scenario. The goal with this deck is to cheat out either a big spell or a 6-mana minion as soon as possible. Then you continue to push damage and pressure the board with cards like Conman and Marin and even Casilagos. The deck wins by having an explosive mid-game that seemingly never ends, and then you eventually finish off your opponent with a Galactic Orb into even more nonsense, assuming you already have your powerful spells loaded into the orb. Your best two plays are first to play King Tide or Skyla, and then cast Tsunami as soon as possible, and then Conman the Tsunami the next turn to literally flood the board with stats and direct damage. The second powerful play is to cheat out Norganon and copy Norganon with either Conman or Reverberations to lock your opponent out of the game. Because this is a 40 card deck, it is running many cards that can be considered filler. These cards are impactful, but generally are less powerful than our ideal plays. Some of these cards are in the deck as a way to spend mana while building a board that keeps your opponent busy. Some of these cards are in the deck to help with the other aggressive boards your opponent might be playing, and this is how you kind of survive against those. The following cards are tempo cards that can be played proactively if you can't force a strong play with either your activators or your big spells. I don't recommend going out of your way to play these cards, but here they are. Miracle Salesman, Watercolor Artist, Gold Panner, Greedy Partner, Mixologist, Robocaller, and Colt Neophyte all fit into this tempo minions category that we use to fight for the board early. These cards are good on their own, they're just not the point of the deck really. So spend your mana on them, use them as efficiently as you can. Just spend all your mana early game. It's going to help you get to these mid-game turns more safely, and these are how you take the board first. Oftentimes, if you just win the board with these minions, then everything else just kind of falls into place and you don't have to do anything. Now, if your opponent is playing an aggressive deck and then has a board full of minions that are causing you problems, thankfully we have ways to deal with that. Rising Waves, Reverberation, Primordial Glyph, Star Power are all great cards you can use to defend yourself against basically any board. These cards are almost entirely defensive options, but there's a lot of ways you can use them to push damage, such as clearing the board early so you can play a Tsunami, which then pushes more damage. And if your opponent doesn't have minions, most of your big spells will do more damage. Now let's talk about the mid game. This deck is mostly a mid-range mage deck over everything else. You win by having the most powerful turns, ideally between turn 4 and 9, into a Galactic Projection Orb finale. Most games end around this time, and it's important to know how to take advantage of your best plays to win these games as efficiently as possible. As mentioned previously, you primarily focus every game on playing Tsunami, Volley, or Norgannon early. Norgannon is probably the most underrated card in Standard. Seashill on turn 3, into Norgannon on turn 4, into Conman on turn 5 is the single strongest play you can make consistently in all of Standard Hearthstone. This comes down early enough that it will single-handedly win you the game if you can get it on curve. Norgannon's abilities are to deal damage, tax enemy cards for 1 turn, and to cast secrets. These values all start small. Norgannon's passive says that it will double these effects each time one of them is used. That means eventually the deal 5 damage will become deal 20 damage. The normal way you make use of this is to first make your opponent's cost 1 more, then cast secrets, and then cast 20 damage. Now if you're lucky, you could get Summoning Ward off of the secrets, which will copy Norgannon.
Norgannon!
That alone would be 40 damage. You could also get Reverberation to then copy the Norgannon after using one of its abilities to increase the damage as well. Or just copy 220 damage Norgannons. So Norgannon does a deceptively huge amount of damage, is very, very disruptive. If you can conman it, it continues to be disruptive for multiple turns, and I think is one of the most powerful Titans you can play right now. The fact that it's 6 mana and 8 health means that it's...
Thick Wizard! I'm the Thick Wizard!
I do think it's important to note that Puzzle Master Khadgar is also very playable on turn 4, and it can also win games. The Magic Wisdom Ball you get from Khadgar will cast 6 spells from a pool of cards that you can see on the screen here. These spells are helpful, meaning they won't directly hurt you. That means it won't fireball your own face or any of your minions, won't cast a mirror image if you have a full board, and won't draw you cards if you have a full hand. Beyond that, the helpful spells are not always going to be the most helpful. It seems relatively random what Khadgar will play, as long as the spell doesn't directly impact you negatively.
Stupid.
Hoping for Flamestrike or Blizzard from Khadgar is unreliable, but sometimes it is your best option, so note that if you have no other out, you might as well play Khadgar, see if he saves you. But if you can play him early while you're already ahead, Khadgar will pay for itself in no time, even if he just fireballs your opponent's face by 2 and casts 1 secret. Boom, that is a very effective Khadgar. Tsunami will send out 4 water elementals that freeze whatever they attack. This card should be played anytime you can play it and have the board space, because you do need the board space if you want to have it cast all 4 water elementals. That's the most complicated part of this card. It can be cheated out with Marin, Portalmancer, Skyla, Castellagos, and King Tide. Watercolor Artist will also always draw Tsunami if there's one in your deck, and that can also enable it to be played early if you play that card early. And you can use Seashill and coins to play it early as well. Sunset Volley has a similar effect in that it deals a lot of damage and also makes a board. I prefer Sunset Volley when my board is already kind of full, and this will also deal 10 damage regardless if your board is full. So if you just need to deal 10 damage and you don't care about the minion, you can also do that with this card. There's a few 10 drops that are particularly impactful. 2 of them have Rush, and a couple of them can hit with help with taunts. There's also a factory assembly bot that is very strong because it can deal direct damage by summoning a 6/7 that attacks. Just know that majority of the time with this card you will be making an 8/8, And if you're going to be con manning the spell and you're worried that you need to get just the damage in, I do recommend con manning this over Tsunami. Again, if the board space is going to be an issue. Castellagos is a very strong play you can cheat out early. He's not as good if you coin him out because you lose the free first spell passive that he has on the card. But there's a few nice things about Castellagos that are unique to him. One, if your opponent is casting a Neophyte-like effect, Castellagos will actually overwrite that entirely. So if you only have 8 mana and you play Castellagos, you can play any spell for free that's in your hand, including the one that you discover. So sometimes your opponent will play like Neophytes or Speaker Stompers and try and stop you from playing a spell, and boom, you Castellagos, you play it anyway, and they basically wasted their turn. Really good. You can also coin out Castellagos if you have to, just to make a body, then coin man it the next turn to have a 4-mana Tsunami or Volley, however you want to do that. That play is a little bit trickier. Obviously, if you cast a mage spell of any kind or anything that's not rogue before the con man, it will mess that up. So be careful with that play, but it is a useful play sometimes. That about covers the mid game. It's relatively simple. Just go for these strong plays and then spend your mana as you can. Now, late game with this deck is a little bit rare, but not impossible. Electric Projection Orb into Con Man is likely to defeat any control deck at any stage of the game, assuming that Sunset Volley and Tsunami are already in the card. Some decks, such as Dungar Druid or other 30-card scam decks, don't require such an explosive finisher for us to win the game versus them. Controlling the board and then playing Marin will give you enough extra value that you can outlast just about every other deck. Please note, Marin spells you cast do go into your Galactic Projection Orb, so try your best to remember what 3 cast spells you played before you play your orb, and take that into consideration when you pick your spells off of Marin. Now, Marin isn't exclusively a late game card. It's generally strong at all phases, but I do think many games late game does come down to how you use your Marin. Now, final tips with this deck is just that King Tide on 4 when you're going first will prevent your opponent from playing any spells the following turn. If you're going second and play King Tide, however, you're on average discounting your opponent's big spells. If they're playing Druid or Mage specifically, even some Death Knights are running C&E right now, so be careful with that play. Sometimes you have to go for that, but just be aware. Con Man is very flexible in this deck as well. I've talked about some of the more powerful plays you can make with it, but I wouldn't hold Con Man if he's strong in other ways. For example, you just cast Rising Waves to clear board versus another mid-range / aggro deck, and your hand isn't very strong to follow up. And now your opponent has another board. Well, guess what? Con Man into another Rising Waves is a good way to stabilize. Even more than that, if you cast Star Power and then Con Man at the next turn, you basically prevent your opponent from having a board between turns 4 and 6, which is really good because we want those mid-game power spikes to well, we want to survive long enough to get to them. So in general, if you get to the late game with this deck, you should be winning. Surviving the mid game and having a strong mid game is the primary difference maker between a successful big mage and a less successful big spell mage. I think the overall this is the best deck during this Renathal event, and I think it will continue to be a very powerful, potentially tier 1, tier 2 deck in the next expansion in some form. So this is a great deck to learn and practice now if you want to have a consistent, easy legend climb. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing as it supports the channel directly. I have more guides coming out soon, and I've set it on a target of at least 3 guides per week in the next couple of weeks. Thank you guys for all the support so far as well. I think it looks like you guys are enjoying these, so I'm going to keep making them as best as I can. I'm also working on a new player guide, so if you know anybody who's getting into Hearthstone, once that guide is up, I'll let you guys all know, and that'll be the video that you can show to get your friends and family into the game as well, if you want to cast that curse upon them, of course. Also, did you know that I stream every day on Twitch? Bye!